Okay, it's on now, Christian. On my ear. Test, test. Check, check. See, what did, what did Jesus say? Blessed are the peacemakers. What? All set? Okay, that's it. I guess. Don't dare talk too loud. All right. Well, it's going to get turned off now.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Sit up front if you want to see. I want to first introduce our team, just in case you don't know who they are. Over here we have Eloise Mitchell, Richard Fedchenko, Bonnie Unruh, Robert Henneke, Al Souza, as Charlotte Ibarra, and myself. We are going to go over, Richard is going to do an actual presentation on the results of the Congregational survey today. So hopefully if you have any questions, go ahead and keep them at the end. We will have a time for question and answer afterwards. What else am I supposed to say? I think that's it. I did want to say that we are moving along in our process. We have posted the job description, and we do already have some resumes in, so we are moving forward. And I'm going to go ahead and let Richard take it from here and present us all of the data.
Okay. The mic is primarily because we're putting this on YouTube, so people who can't be here can listen in when they can. Okay, first slide, please. Basic information. Christian, is it possible to put it on this monitor here?
Oh yeah. Can someone turn the TV on for him? It's on the piano, the remote. Just point it at this TV.
So, just to let you know about the scope of what we did, there were 74 people who responded, which we thought was really good response for a church our size. And it was about equally divided between men and women. It reflected, the age distribution reflected the fact that we are certainly a mature congregation. And over 90% of the people who responded were church members, and over 60% have been members for 10, 20, or even more years than that. So with that, let's look at some of the statistical charts that help us understand this. The first one is age distribution. So next slide. There. Can you read the bottom numbers? Okay, I can't. So we had a small number of those who were preteens and teens, but when we got into the 20s, the 30s and 40s, that age realm where people are starting their careers but also starting families, they're young families, they're progressing families, that's obviously a pretty big hole for us. And the large part of the population is there at the far right-hand end where you see the 60s, the 70s, and the 80 pluses existing. Now I asked the question on the title of this slide, does this represent our neighborhood? Next slide, please. This is the population distribution inside a 5-mile radius as given to us by the U.S. Census Bureau. And unfortunately, they have a different way of cutting the age groups. So instead of 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they have, well, first of all, the first one is 0 to 4 years of age. So those are the babies. And then it goes on to 5 to 17, which they call mandatory education years. So those are the kids that are in elementary school through high school. But then it goes on to those who are going into college or starting their careers, some even at those young ages starting a family. And then we have 25 to 34. And then the big one is 35 to 54. That's a 20-year span. So it's twice as many people as the other ones, but twice as many, twice the age span. But you can see that around our church, within a 5-mile radius, which is probably a pretty reasonable distance to drive to get to church, there are, if you add those numbers together, about 150,000 people. So the field is ripe. And could you, yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, how much history do we have? It shows that the first bar is those who have been in the church for under 5 years, and then it's 5 to 9 years, and then it's 10 to 20, and then greater than 20. It's interesting that in the category of 5 to 9, it seems like there was somehow a dip. Either we didn't have a lot of people joining in the church, or those who joined didn't stay. But in the immediately preceding 5 years, the number is higher. So somehow we added more people in that last 5-year period. But you can see that 40 plus 22, maybe 62% of the congregation has 10 or more years of experience. Okay? So, what does that mean? Well, that could make it really hard for a new pastor. And the reason is that we've been doing things for so long that we think we know the right way to do them. You know, and we are not calling a pastor to tell him the right way to do things. So we have to be a little bit careful when the new pastor arrives. Just keep that in mind. God has a plan and a man for us. And God knows what his plan is. So that man will be led by the Holy Spirit, so that in all things we can be Christ's church and in his will. Next, we are an involved congregation. This reads minimum, low, moderate, high, and very high. And the moderate to very high represents 70% of the congregation, of the people who answered this. And I want to point out one thing. A number of the shut-ins who did the survey made sure that we understood that although they were checking that they were now minimally involved, that had not always been the case, that they had been really heavily involved in earlier years. But that's a real positive in calling a new pastor, to say this is a church where people really get involved and do things. Next, please. We asked the question about what age you would anticipate the pastor would be. And we said you can choose one age, like 20s or 30s or 40s, or you could circle a range, 30s through 50s, for example. First of all, take a look at the far right. The highest bar is the one that says doesn't matter, that DM down there. Click the slide, please. Okay, so that little yellow legend on there says doesn't matter means, quote, other things are more important. As we've thought about why people would say that age doesn't matter, I mean, clearly you don't hire somebody who's 12, so age does matter. But in the final analysis, it's not so much what his age is, but how well he fits the needs of the congregation and where God wants to place him. One thing to keep in mind on this, however, is that a pastor who's already in his 40s or 50s could already have financial commitments that would put him out of range of our compensation package. Someone who has, 2 car payments and 2 kids in college may not be able to get by on what we can offer. Next, please. We then ask about education level. And once again, there was a choice of doesn't matter. So that's the far right-hand blue bar. It's not nearly as high as it was on the last one. And click again, Christian, thank you. It reads, doesn't matter means, quote, my focus is on how God has worked in his mind. So, I have heard lay preachers deliver incredible sermons. So, yes, we would like to do our search and be looking for someone who has the education background, and we'll see what the choices were. But that's not the only criterion. So the one in the center was seminary / MDiv, or Masters of Divinity, Master in some religious field. On the questionnaire, those two were separated. We had seminary and we had master's level. But in essence, those two actually mean the same thing. You get a master's degree in a religious area at a seminary, and seminaries typically don't offer bachelor's degrees, only graduate degrees. So I combined the results of those two, and that came up to 50%. So yes, we are looking for a well-grounded pastor who knows his Bible, knows his theology. The other kinds of courses they take in a seminary are things like how to preach, how to deliver a sermon, how to prepare a sermon, how to study for one, how to do the research. So looking for someone who is well-grounded that way. Next slide, please. We ask about preferences for a pastor from what kind of experience background should he have? Should it be someone who was in a church our size? Or what about someone who's coming from a smaller church but is ready to move on to a larger responsibility? What about somebody who's been in a big church and maybe is, I don't know, quieting down, slowing down, and ready to just take on something at a smaller level? It's pretty clear here. If I combine those two of almost 40 and 30, that's again almost 70%, who basically said, let's try and find someone who has experience in a church our size. So then the question is, what's a church our size? And we have gone through the statistics of attendance, typical attendance on Sunday mornings, adding in the typical attendance online. And we've come up with a number around 100 to 115. As I recall, that's the figure that we were using. So that kind of tells you, we find someone who's been in a church of around that size, it will be compatible with the kinds of results that we got here. That was 67%, adding those two together. Next, please. People in the ministry, men in the ministry as well as women, have a calling. They're called to a specific kind of ministry typically. Some are called to a teaching ministry, or some are called to even a music ministry. We asked the question on the survey, what calling do you think would be most amenable to someone being successful as the pastor of our church? And we had the areas of preaching and evangelism, pastoring and teaching. And there we are, pastoring by far the highest choice, well over 50%, which means looking for a man who has been called to care for and protect and call by name the flock, the members of our church. Someone who would search and rescue those in difficult circumstances. Next slide, please. We had this question. I know it's hard to read the legends down below, and I will read those for you. We ask about spiritual gifts, and we ask what would be the 3 most important spiritual gifts that would help our new pastor in addressing the needs of our congregation. Remember that God has promised that every one of us has a spiritual gift. He has not promised that anyone will receive all of them. And in fact, perhaps not many get a large number of them. But we ask you to make 3 choices. And the top 3 choices that came through were the spiritual gift of faith, of wisdom, and of leadership. And then you notice that it drops down, and there's not a lot of variation in the height of the next, 4 or 5 that are up there. What that means is that there's no real choice among those, and that's in a quite different category than those first 3. So our first 3 are, as I've put in the title of this slide, a man of faith and wisdom and a leader. That's what we have said we would be looking for. Next slide, please. A pastor who is people-oriented and a visionary. In a similar manner to the last slide, we asked the question about what about natural or developed abilities, not spiritual gifts, but, some people are born communicators, and some are born listeners, and some are trained in schools or on the job or wherever on how to do various things like counseling, for example. And so we asked those questions and had those choices on there. The top 3, boy, I can read it easier up here. The first one is developing relationships, then comes good communicator, and then vision and planning. And right after that, the 4th one is listening. And keep in mind that listening is part of being a good communicator. So the second one and the 4th one kind of go together and maybe make a stronger combination than even the first one. But developing relationships obviously requires good communication and being a good listener. So all those things are really consistent. And vision and planning, that goes hand in glove with the spiritual gift that we saw was number 3 on the last slide, which was leading. A good leader is a visionary and good at planning. Okay, next slide, please. A trustworthy spiritual pastor who is open, understanding, and humble. We ask about character traits and qualities. What is a person really like? And so we had all of these choices and said, what do you think are the most important 3? So in sequence, they are ethical and honest. Yeah, that's pretty important. And then spiritual, approachable, compassionate. So that has dropped down from 2 very, very, very high ones there, ethical and spiritual, down to approachable and compassionate, which probably go hand in hand. To be approachable means you're compassionate, wanting to be able to be empathetic with the people who come to you. In fact, empathy is another one further down the line, but it's there too. And then humble and wise. And the last two are hospitable and winsome and persuasive. I suppose in a way, winsome and persuasive could be taken from a negative point of view. Say, I don't want a soap salesman as my pastor, but there's a very positive side to that as well. Okay, on the next slides, we had a series of questions that came out the same way, but I thought it might be a little easier to read them. And I'm sorry, I didn't go back and change these. But let's go to the next slide. I changed the way that it's presented. So I changed it from a vertical axis to horizontal. Okay, I don't know that it's any easier to read. Maybe it is. It looks like the letters are bigger. Okay, but it did an interesting thing. It put the most important thing on the bottom. So you have to be able to read it that way. So, what style of sermon? Oh, that was a really interesting one. We had a lot of different kinds of sermons that we can listen to and hear presented to us. And we have a lot of different kinds of people in our congregation. And the question read something like, what kind of a sermon speaks the best to you? Where do you learn the most? Where do you get the most value? What brings you closer to God? And so certainly the bottom one, personal, relational, and engaging, is important, and then spiritually nourishing, and then an application to life. But you know, the way those things are grouped and the gentle slope of as they fall off says there are a lot of people who fall into each one of those categories. And in fact, since we could choose three, all of us are going to fall into one of the or three different areas up there, which says, you know what? We need a pastor who has a variety of approaches to presenting a sermon, who can get a good spiritual message across in a number of different ways. And so we have that variety that can speak to all of us at one time or another. The next one is how we see the way a pastor should invest his time. And again, the most important ones are on the bottom. So, interesting. Preparing to preach and teach. So that's spending time in the office or wherever it takes, but spending time to get the information together, to do the research, to do the prayer, to follow look for the leading of the Holy Spirit, and get ready to either teach a lesson or preach a sermon. And right after that is the leading of evangelism, discipleship, and caring. Well, another way to think about that is it's called equipping the saints for service. It's the pastor training us, teaching us how we're supposed to be doing those things, and not expecting the pastor to be doing all that work. And so that's a very important part of it. And then comes the third one, which goes right hand in hand with the first one. So the first one is preparing to preach, and the second one is basically preaching, planning and conducting the services, being there to be the focal point of how that worship service proceeds. It's interesting to me, counseling is of high importance in this set. Oh, by the way, before I even go there, the fourth thing is praying. So yes, maybe that should have been first, I could argue, but nonetheless, it was really in among the very top areas. And clearly, we want a praying man as a pastor. And then comes counseling. So a little while ago, I showed you a slide where counseling was kind of down at the tail end of things that he had been prepared to do through training and experience. And yet this says, I expect him to be doing a lot of counseling or spending significant time with it. So a little bit of inconsistency, but I do believe, based on all the other things that we've seen, that counseling is an important part of the, if you will, the toolkit that a pastor has to bring to bear. Then comes spiritual growth, and visit existing and prospective members, and visit the sick. Oh, 2 bars for doing visits. And I think that reflects, to a great extent, the aging character of our congregation. There were quite a number of people who completed this survey from home. We delivered the deacons took the survey out and then picked them up and brought them back. And hopefully, those who did it from home will be able to watch this result, because we're doing this on YouTube. One other thing. The bottom, the top one, but the least up there, is private family time. Now, we had 19 items on our list, so this is only the top 10. There were another 9 that tailed out below this. But private family time made it on the top 10, and clearly that relates to what we saw before with someone with family values. When I was reading, remember on page 2 of the survey, you probably don't remember it was page 2, but on page 2 there was a blank section that just said, what are the important things you think the pastor needs to know? And you just wrote whatever was on your mind. So we read through those and collected them and combined them, and found that there were a number of people who were concerned about a number of areas. In addition, on the list where we said, what should the top 5 priorities and the next 5 priorities be for the, as a way to spend his time, we also had a column that said, what should the pastor not ever do, never be involved in? And so, combining those two, we came up with some areas where it says that there have to be some lower priorities. And if the pastor's not careful, they could become time traps. It's the urgency factor. So let's see, go ahead and hit the first one had to do with administration of programs and property, facilities, the office. Next was supervision of staff and volunteers, even contractors. And then, before I talk about that, let's just talk about the first 2. We have a strong organizational structure at this church. And we've got systems so that we can keep a minimum of demands on our pastor for doing these kinds of things. But I want you to know that many of these things are specifically mentioned as a part of the pastor's responsibility in the official job description that there is for him. And in fact, some of them are even mentioned in the Constitution or the bylaws. Okay, the next one, Christian, SBC, Southern Baptist Conference. Primarily at the state and local level. So could it be that someone might get too involved in that? Yeah, I think that's possible. Get involved in the politics of the organization and so on. But it really is helpful for us and for them, for us as a church, to be represented and be involved in the organization of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that also is part of the pastor's responsibilities in the bylaws and in the job description. And finally, we had community churches on there. There's nothing mentioned in the job description or the bylaws that requires the pastor to be involved in that. If opportunities arise, I think that would be great. I think ecumenical things going on, maybe the joining of a couple of choirs together to put on a presentation or, some such thing. But, yeah, that should be of lower priority than taking care of our own congregation here at home. Okay, so that brings us to kind of how are we using this information? You want me to? Okay, so we've already heard a little bit of this from the introduction that Sheila made. We have updated the senior pastor job description. That was done by our personnel committee. That was then approved and passed on to us, and we then use that, next item, we use that to create what's called a position listing or a job listing. That allows us to publish it on job sites on the internet. And there are job sites that are available to us from the Southern Baptist Convention and from Jessup University. And there are many others as well. So we've made our initial listings, and we've already published on those two sites. And we will make a decision on moving to other sites as well, depending on what kind of results we get from the sites that we're already posted on. And we have already received some responses. And this is a slow time of year for people looking for work, looking for jobs. So, if a pastor's getting ready to move on to a different church, a different responsibility, he may well wait until the beginning of the year. So we don't expect to see a large influx of resumes until early in January. And then our workload really starts to multiply. Next one. There will be several, once we start getting these resumes in significant quantities, there will be several levels of review that will take place. The first one will be to take a look at just the very basic information of, what kind of experience, education, background, age, and so on do we have here. We haven't defined a specific person that we're looking for. We're not saying, okay, we need somebody with a master's degree who's 35 years old and 2 kids, and we haven't defined that. We have some general guidelines to follow. But there will be many resumes that we receive that will be way outside those guidelines. And when we get those, we will immediately send them, after the committee agrees, we will then send them a letter that says, thank you for your interest, but we will not be in contact with you again. Something to that effect. And for those who are still, who are valid applicants, we will send them a note that basically says something like, thank you for your interest. We are still in the process of gathering information, and we'll be back to you shortly. And then after we get a sufficient number of resumes, we will end the period for receiving more resumes, and at that point we will start looking at them in great detail and trying to determine who will fit into the top 10. We'll go ahead and go to the next. Yeah, we'll be conducting interviews, listening to sample sermons. If they are fairly close by, we may even go and visit their church on a Sunday morning and listen to a sermon and see what the church is like, what the general philosophy is of worship there, beyond just the sermon itself. And then when it finally gets down to the point of the top 3, we will be doing interviews with personal interviews and checking resumes, help me somebody, help. References, thank you. Checking references. And then finally, that will bring us down to a final choice where we say, you have to remember, all of this is being done by your committee with a great shroud of prayer. But I want to let you know you have to support us. It's not enough for just the committee to be praying about this. The entire church needs to be praying. And when we get to the point of being able to say, this is the man that God has provided for us, then at that point, he will be presented to the church, an in-person visit, a Sunday sermon, a chance perhaps to meet in small groups and be able to talk and ask questions, and then finally a vote of whether to call that person or not. And finally, just a heads up, be prepared to discover that whatever we have in mind for what this pastor is going to be like and what God has in mind for us, he may have totally other priorities for us. This may be a time when God will say, there's a future for HBBC in this direction, not this one. We have no idea where God will be taking us, but we need to be open to all possibilities as he leads us. I'll be happy to take any questions. Sheila, you want to come on up? I know there were a lot of graphs up here, a lot of charts, so if you have any questions on those, I can go back to any of them if you would like.
Okay. Do we have any questions?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. What is it? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so valuable to us.
Any more questions? Miss Nancy?
In your references and reviews, I just want to make sure that having been fingerprinted and gone through that is included in
Absolutely. We will have references, background checks, fingerprinting, all of the above. It's very important for us to do that. Absolutely. No, we have just started getting resumes. We just put our jobs on the William Jessup and Southern Baptist Convention sites. So we are just now starting to get resumes in. Our group probably will wait until January to meet again, and then we'll start going through resumes at that point.
I think that's a good, observation that people are not looking at jobs and stuff like that during this time.
Right, and especially, most of the consensus is that we're looking for a family person. Holidays are important for families, pastors as well. So, I would imagine that person, even if they are planning on moving to another position, would be wanting to spend that time with their family during the holidays before they, get down to more business and looking for another position. Yes, ma'am. That's all Richard right there.
Thank you.
He took all the data that we came up with in our surveys. The team kind of parsed it out, and then he took the data and kind of put all the slides together.
By the way, did you do the charts in Excel?
Yeah.
I think there is a way that you can reverse them. Change the sort order so that it comes, the long ones will come to the top.
Okay, any more questions? We do have the survey available. If you would like a printed copy, let me know, and I can send you via email a printed copy of the results that Richard presented. But if there's no more questions, we are going to wrap it up. George, would you close us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks for the work this team has done, Lord, and for their devotion. And we just pray, Lord, that you will open the hearts of those that you've selected, Father, to come out. We pray for the new pastor here, Lord, that you'll send the right person here, Lord, and that will accept him, Father, and that will move forward to you, to your work. Father, we just thanks for all those with us tonight. We just pray for those that can make it. We lift them up to you, Father. Thank you for the work again that is done, Lord, and we continue to hold them up, Father, to continue to give them strength and wisdom, Father, in that process. Go with us, we pray.